Aware that whenever we talk about themes such as overcoming depression, because of the prevalence of it in this modern world and the desperation that people feel and all the different avenues that one might take, there can be this almost sensationalism when we talk about a journey like the one in this episode. So, what I really want to underline before we even dive in is that as you'll hear in this episode with Janet Hill, modern day medicine woman, her journey has been nothing that you could describe as kind of simple or quick fix or something that I would say is a kind of like, oh, here you go, here's a magic bullet. Instead, it is a deep interweaving of ancient ways, a return to connections with the land and spirituality, and ultimately knowing one's own self. So, if you're interested in a journey of overcoming depression that interweaves those kind of themes, this could be the episode for you. Let's dive in. Hello, Janet. A huge warm welcome to the show.
Thank you, Leanne. I am very excited.
I just had one of those moments where I had a flashback to our very first conversation. Who would have thought here would be, how many years is it later?
4, I think.
3, 4 years
Yeah.
later in this conversation.
It's mind-blowing to even imagine the change in me throughout that time period is all I've ever dreamed of, Leanne, and way more.
Yeah, talk about transformations. In fact, I know there's a point in your story that kind of like is seemingly where it all starts, but I actually feel in this moment I'd like to at least kind of a light there to where you were, it like just, during that and even in that first conversation we had. I feel like that actually would be a really beautiful place to start. So would you mind gathering that thread and sharing why we're saying, wow, what a transformation? Where were you then?
I think the most prominent memory, because I don't remember the detail of the conversation as such, but it was a moment that I will always remember, like the essence of it rather than the exact conversation. But where I was then was in deep fear. Absolute fear. Not necessarily around my life or anything like that, but particularly around this idea of me becoming a coach as I thought then.
So did you know? You'd had even more to fear had you known, but yeah. And what did you know of yourself back then? Like how would you have seen yourself described, Janet, if someone had asked you about you back then?
Gosh. I mean, by that point, I had finally experienced relief from so much of my suffering. So that's so important to say from a personal perspective, from who I was as me, that I no longer had seen myself as broken.
Yeah, he's already had, such a transformation already.
Yes. And what I now know, looking back, is it wasn't truly healed. It was a transformation of one level, but that suffering and that deep darkness and all of that anxiety that I was living with would have come back had it not been for this sort of journey, this path that you and I have been on over the last 4 years together. And that's I really saw that the other day, and it's so important. It was true that I'd had that experience and that sort of relief, but there was still so much about me that I had no idea. Absolutely no idea. Both in terms of my personal wounding. I didn't even know what that word really meant. I didn't understand how such significant experiences as a child had impacted me. And they got pushed away. And I had no idea that I was here to be so spiritual and to love spirituality and embodying it in a way that I had never been shown before.
Oh my goodness. I had full body chills hearing you say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, my dear, let's go back a few years now to the place that you kind of feel that you started to, I guess, experience such challenges, such darkness that is kind of like that sort of seminal point of your story. Let's start there.
Yeah. So coming up for 25 years ago, I always know that because it's around the same age as Alex, my eldest son. So he's 24 now and he'll be 25 in December. So I was 6 months pregnant, mid-October, and my brother, who was 34, died. And the truth is that wasn't really a shock. It was a shock of it actually happening, because it always is. But he had struggled for all of his adult life with deep drug and alcohol addiction. But it was still a shock, obviously. And especially to be pregnant. Like it felt, I remember being so petrified of that Alex, obviously wasn't called like the baby, feeling it in me. You know, and it's sort of like, I was like, this is too much. I can't, you can, you kind of know that the baby feels you. And it really impacted my feeling of how he was feeling as well. The baby, I didn't know he was a boy. So that was massive, obviously. And there was the circumstances of his death were especially traumatic. There wasn't a funeral. There was a court case and all of those things. Yeah. So I couldn't even go to the funeral before I gave birth. And so then I had Alex, my eldest son, in the December. And then in early January, the 2nd of January, my father died of a heart attack, aged 58. And yeah, even now sharing it, of course you can hear my voice. It's still really emotional, but emotional in a really beautiful way. That I just want to say that's where I am now with it, even though I can feel the emotion rising. It's beautiful emotion. It's emotion to be with.
Yeah.
And from then on, I experienced such darkness. As classically we would call depression, a lot of anxiety, a lot of what we would classify as mental health symptoms. And yet, managed to beautifully have 2 more children within 3 years. And
my goodness.
I know.
I had 2 in 2 and yes. Idea of another one. It's quite mind-blowing.
Yeah, well, I was very driven. It looked like that was the problem, was those 2 deaths.
Yeah, understandably. And I think let's let's take a moment to really honor that. On one level, that is so.
Yeah.
And yet, as so often is the case, it's not the whole story. And I think this is where it might be helpful to distinguish that there is, with so many of these like big initiations of the soul, there is a kind of like modern, mundane, mainstream lens on these things, which doesn't recognize them as anything remotely to do with the soul. And then there is an ancient way of seeing these things, which takes us in a completely different direction. It gives us a completely different understanding. And I know, of course, that wasn't, available to you at the time. No. But what I think might be helpful is if perhaps now we go forward back, if we come more to kind of what you've understood about yourself and also those events, which I know has meant sort of looking back actually even earlier to your childhood, but also who you are. This is for me the most profound aspect of this work of understanding our myth. Is that we get to understand, like we peel off all of these ideas of what our culture, our family have told us we are and what things are, and we start to see the truth of those things in all of their beauty, but also all of the pain that can come with that. And so I'd love to hear your sense of, you're saying kind of like, yes, it seemed as though it was those deaths. It seemed as though it was what we might call mental health problems. What would you now say about that and what you've discovered through that exploration?
Well, the simple answer that comes to mind is that it has gifted me and shown me that my soul was calling me to be, to understand, and ultimately to be my medicine, have a role in this life, in this modern life, in a way that I had no idea at all. That's the sort of most succinct way.
Okay, so now let's go the non-succinct way.
Okay.
Well, what have you? Let's say the S word, and it's not the sex word, the shaman word. I think that might be a really helpful time to really meet that head on, because again, that was probably the least likely thing in your awareness, certainly when we spoke back 4 years ago. But as so often is the case, people who have that soul calling often do have these big death initiations. I mean, of course, we all, one way or another, are going to experience bereavement. And yet there's some of us that meet death in particular ways that can be either a death experience ourselves, or it can be the death of someone close to us. And there's a particular way that what that either opens us up to, or kind of like has such a sort of profoundly disruptive effect on what we thought was the life we were here to live, that we only can trace our steps back. And I'm talking very much from experience here too, with actually several death initiations, but the obviously most profound one being the death of my father. It's only when we've gone so far we can look back and go, oh, I now understand. That was the death initiation that was calling me to my calling.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear your sense of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think it's really important to say is that whilst it took me a really long time from that to now, that was actually the right thing as well. Things kept me safe. There's so much more there, as well as like I just wasn't ready, and that's okay.
Yes. Yeah.
There are days when I'm like, why couldn't I have known this sooner and earlier, and all of those things? And it's like, no, it happens when it needs to happen, of course. So when we first met and we first spoke, I had sort of come across a vaguely spiritual path, which had slightly surprised me. But it still was intellectual. So that sort of kept me happy. Like, it was okay because this explained things intellectually. Again, small openings as much as we can take. But when we first had that conversation, Leanne, I did not know what a shaman was. I think that's like, I can't think that I even knew it. It wasn't in my awareness at all. And yet, here we are. And that was my calling. So I think that's really important to say. And it's no wonder I had so much fear, because it's such a big myth to take on board. It's such a big calling to be. So the fear makes perfect sense. And the other memory that I have that is so clear to me was during medicine. And you'd said to me, I'm going to share your story, and this is really going to help you, Janet. And I was like, oh, great. Because I was, it was gentle and it was slow, but I was really like looking for more understanding. And I think that's what's just a slight sidetrack on the mything is, like, there was always a part of me, even back before I met you and before that, even when I was 20, 30, I was always trying so hard to understand myself. There was a real push in me. I just wasn't quite looking in the right places until I was.
Yes.
But back to that moment in medicine, you explained about your own sort of shamanic journey and your hallucinations and how that was your sort of call into the shamanic path. And I remember saying to you afterwards, that doesn't help me at all, Leanne. What are you talking about? Do you remember that?
You made me laugh. It's very apt, actually, with as you know, our current quest in Unio is one of humble and really journeying with this notion of humility and what that means for each of us, what it calls us into, and the wounded healer aspect of that. And it's hilarious, really, because it probably has been one of my most humbling months ever. But I also recognise, like, the work I do is just like it's just constantly humbling. It's really made me giggle. It's literally, I don't have an experience almost every day where something like that happens, where I'll think, oh, this will be really serving. This will be like, what the hell? Sorry, I've got no understand. Like, what do you even mean? No, that's totally unhelpful. So, but yes, I do remember. Yeah. It wasn't helpful.
No, but actually, what was then so helpful was, I mean, often when I ask those questions of you, you will send me off on other inquiries and you won't actually answer it directly, which can be obviously the right thing, even though it can be a little frustrating. But this time, and your response to me was so clear, which I can't remember the exact details. It was, whilst you didn't have hallucinations, Janet, your depression, your struggles were the darkness calling into the sort of shamanic role. And you were so crystal clear there. I think you obviously sensed, no, I need to make, she suffered enough. We have. And even though intellectually, my it made no sense. Still, there was a part of me that just felt, wow, this makes sense.
Mm.
And I've never felt so understood and so seen and so welcomed ever from a, there are other places in my life when I have felt that, by the way, but in this depth of really knowing. So I didn't really know what it would lead to, and I didn't really understand it, but I knew that so much of my life made far more sense when you said that.
It is, gosh, there's so much come up for me as you've said that. So it's one of those moments where I'm like, okay, which of those threads do I pull on first? So I'm going to say a couple of things, and I'd love to see if you're willing to share a little bit more about how this was showing up for you. So one thing that feels helpful to say, and regular listeners of the show or people who have journeyed with us in Unio or various crucibles will know this, but much of the work we do is archetypal in nature. And working with archetypes in a way that I now actually understand has always been shamanic. It was a shamanic way of working with archetypes way before I actually understood that's what was happening. But in short, that's been the way that we've worked for many, many years, and illuminating these incredibly powerful archetypes like the shaman, but so many others as well. It could be the queen, it could be the priest, it could be the sage, all of these different archetypes. Right now, the sacred prostitute, which is wreaking absolute havoc. The wounded healer. These are all archetypes that hold so much guidance and healing and way showing and power, that when we are able to make them conscious, invoke them, can literally be life-changing. And so that's the reason we do that. And so the reason I'm saying this is firstly to say, just because someone has the clear imprint, which is obviously something that Jonathan and I are so used to now, to sort of be able to see kind of like, these things in someone's life, in someone's being, indicate this particular archetype is calling to them. So we're attuned to that, and we won't necessarily like directly give it to someone, unless in the example that you're talking about is like they're not going to come to this on their own. We have to be direct with this one. But it's not us saying, therefore, that person necessarily has to actually be a shaman or has to actually be whatever the thing is. Is again, this is an archetypal level of, these are the particular gifts, but also the struggles, the ways that you might want to journey, serve your medicine, that you've now got this model, but it's more than a model, it's a model and a guiding one to help show you this. And so when we're talking about these things, fundamentally, when I'm talking about at an archetypal level. However, for some of us, there will be a way of living into that archetype that becomes more literal, becomes more material. And it's not that that's better, it's just what's aligned for someone. For someone, in fact, I've got an example of a student come to mind that right this moment, who, because much of her work is in the corporate world, she probably still a lot of the time calls herself an executive coach, even though the archetype of the shaman is so alive in her. And so this isn't at all like, now you need to go be initiated as a shaman. It's not to call yourself a shaman. It is to understand, like, what does that archetype mean for you, bring alive in you, show you. And so I just want to say that more generally. I know you know this, Janet, but I think it's a helpful distinction to make.
Yeah.
And an aspect that I think feels really helpful here, if you're willing to share, and I know this in some ways is a little bit kind of on the edges of things that you're still, living into. You also had, whilst not hallucinations in the way I had, what we might call atypical experiences that weren't necessarily things that we have the cultural context to understand, that were distressing for you. Do you know what I'm talking about, and are you willing to share a bit about that?
I'm very willing to share. Could you be more explicit? Because
So
lots of things come to mind.
yeah. So for example, the chanting we were talking about earlier this week, and the different ways that has shown up over the years.
Yes. Okay. I think before that, I think it's just like there's like when you started talking about the shaman and I read some books, there was just, and then sort of started engaging in really gentle practices, very gentle practices. I just started to feel energy and movement in my body. And then began to identify that was spiritual energies sort of moving. And it was really clear to me, looking back, that even though actually, I'm not even going to try and offer a logical explanation for it anymore, I knew that those energies and that experience had been happening throughout my life. I had just shut them down. So that's really, really important. That really helped. And then it's been it was just.
Would you describe how you were, how would you experience those? I know these things aren't necessarily easy to put into words, but as best you're able.
Having to retreat, I think, a lot. Feeling like I needed to get away from people. Because I think I was just feeling so much energy. Having to take time off school when there was outwardly sort of almost really nothing wrong with me. Later on, a lot of screaming and shouting and raging. So sort of a lot of energy things when it was just shut down. And then obviously the deep, deep depression. And it was like too much. I had to close it down. So that fainting at school quite a lot. And generally feeling incredibly uncomfortable in ways that didn't make sense. And again, I can't, it just was like, and even now it's like, that's why my body just seized up, because there was no flow and this energy.
And I know you also had kind of what we might call kind of like sleep talking. Would you share a bit about that?
Yeah, I used to wake up. I mean, we can get to the chanting bit as well in a minute, but it's sort of, very much sort of dreams at night that would be very shouty, end up talking in my sleep, feeling quite distressed, and but in truth, Leanne, the overall feeling of just really feeling like that I was mad and crazy. Genuinely.
Yes.
Really.
Do you know, we've come so far.
I haven't mentioned
I'd actually forgotten how much that was so present for you, wasn't it? It was like that was so much part of your internal narrative of, am I crazy? They're going to think I'm crazy. It's so long since we've been there. I had actually forgotten how present that was. And same for me, as you know, that was a huge, huge fear of my own. It's like, well, if our culture isn't saying this can be anything other than someone who is losing their mind. Potentially, I'm losing my mind. Because if we have no other explanation for these strange things we're experiencing, and the only ways these have been talked about in books and films that are talking about people who are in some way struggling with their mental health, it's terrifying.
Yeah.
And so, like you, I had that very real fear that all of this could add up to something I just don't want to be true, and, struggle to even face, hence, doing everything I could to close that down. But yes, I think that's the profound thing. It's like we can talk about the particular experiences and feelings, but at the heart of it lies this, there's no way I can make sense of this other than the possibility that I'm losing my mind.
Yeah. And so how it's misunderstood, firstly. And then actually, I now see how safe I kept myself, unbeknown to myself. I remember going to see a psychiatrist, and I was really happy because I was I'm going to get some help. I need some help. There's something wrong, and had a conversation with the psychiatrist, and literally I remember telling her what was wrong with me. And she went, "Oh, you seem to know what's going on. Yes, you just need this and this." And sort of dismissed it and gave me some little courses to do or something. And I remember coming out of that going, wow, I fooled her. And that's phenomenal. And it just shows you actually there was such a spirit, soul keeping me safe, because had I actually told her so much of the things that I then was able to tell you and be met with, no, darling, you're really not crazy. It just shows you. And I'm so grateful that I didn't tell her.
Yes. Oh my goodness. That really reminds me. This is something like this has come up a couple of times on the show before. I think the first time was when I was talking to my past teacher, Jez Hughes, about this notion of shamanic sickness. And we were both, if I recall correctly, I think this was on the show, we were both saying we both had this kind of innate sense this isn't something to talk to a doctor about.
Yeah.
And when you said that, I was like, yes, there is this part of us that knows this will lead us into places that actually aren't going to help us.
Yeah. Even though it's such a strange thing because I didn't know it, but yet something was making me shut down. It's so fascinating. Yeah,
it really is. It really is. So, I feel like I just want to drop in here very briefly and then move somewhere else. What we haven't mentioned so far, which I think would be quite amusing for listeners to know, is before all of this, you were, and until very recently, an accountancy teacher.
Yes, that is very true. I know. And this is it's such a sitting here now. It's such a beautiful story. It's beyond amazing.
Magical, even.
Yeah, magical, mythical, all of those things of wow, there I was.
Yeah.
Happened, and again, I don't regret it. It was the right thing for me to do. I slightly wish I'd found this when I was younger, of course, but it's, it's okay. But yes.
We come through it when we're ready.
Yeah, we
do. I want to segue slightly, and this is actually picking up the thread of a conversation we were in earlier this week, which is coming back to this notion that we've kind of touched on a couple of times, but not directly, that, as you know, the work that Jonathan and I do is very much sourced in this notion, I would say principle, but let's say notion for the moment, that our greatest medicine is found in our deepest wound. And as we do the work to illuminate, heal, alchemize that, it becomes first medicine for ourselves, but then for others. But there is definitely a distinction to be made here. For some, that might mean, as in, my case, that is actually to help people, walk a very similar path to me, as in, discover their calling for themselves. That isn't the case for most. More typically, it is understanding how they can be medicine, which might be have some similarities in the ways that their struggles have shown up with the people who are here to receive their medicine, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to have the same calling and same life path. And so I think that's a really important distinction to make. Like, I know that the work you're here to do, the medicine you're here to serve, who you're here to serve it to, isn't people who are likely to also have that calling to shamanism themselves. However, there is such potent medicine that you've received from journeying into these things yourself, and like specifically, these threads around motherhood, mental health, our lack of connection with the spiritual, all of which are kind of, as far as I'm concerned, things that are actually, human birthrights to meet in this different way that isn't available in our mainstream world. So I'd love to hear your sense of that, kind of like, what have you seen? What from your own journey, again, knowing that the women aren't here to, do the same things as you, what have you seen is actually the medicine that the world needs, these particular women who are called to you? What is it that's needed?
Yeah, such a good question, Leanne. And this is, yeah, again, it's like, firstly, it's like, what? This is me. This is what I do. This is what I'm here to do. And personally, firstly, just to feel that and see the truth of it and to be that medicine is also so healing. It's another level of that. What I experienced wasn't just to wake me up shamanically. It was also to deeply, deeply serve this medicine. I think that's
yes, there is something so profoundly healing in that.
Yeah,
you're completely right. Yeah.
And that whatever someone's role in this world is to be it to be an actual accountant and to thrive in that, or to be a teacher or a lawyer, whatever that is, there will still be these wounds that make that so difficult to be. So there is that sort of similarity. Like, it's like letting those wounds that we each have, all of us, every single one, if we wish to look, it doesn't only happen for people who are working in the way that you and I are, and other people. We all have these wounds, and they all create deep stories, deep beliefs, deep pain. And it's really seeing that is a truth, and being able to sit with women in their pain, in their darkness, because I've been there, and hold them through it. And also, consistently, people say to me, I've never told anyone that before. And I'm like, yeah, I know, me too. No one's ever not tried to fix me. No one ever seen me as not broken. No one's ever held me. So that's such an important part of my medicine.
Yes.
Because the darkness just doesn't scare me anymore. Yeah. Whereas I used to run a mile from my own darkness.
Yes, there is a deep, deep acceptance, and even falling in love in a funny way with the darkness that we've experienced, that allows us to sit with it in others.
Yeah.
Yeah, really is very much the
Yeah.
case. And I know, because we've kind of been focusing on ways that people might work, whether it be is, like we say, a shamanic healer or an
Yeah.
accountant.
Yeah.
I think really what's important to say is so much your work is beyond this notion of kind of what the job is someone's here to do. It's much more about, them and their sense of self and their sense of well-being. And specifically, I know much of the work you do is with mothers.
Yes.
And it's a particular way of, I mean, we can use anything as a portal. Again, in the work that Jonathan and I do, we often, most of our work is using this idea that, how are people here to serve? That's the portal.
Yeah.
Whereas motherhood and our experiences of that, the stories we have around that, is another very, very powerful one. And I know, along with Kate Barsby, who's also been on this show before, you do profound work with mothers. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah. It's, we look out in the world and we get told, do this, be this strategy, this book, this way. This is the way to mother. And some of that can be helpful, as you and I well know sometimes, but we are bereft of true elders, ones themselves that are not wounded. And actually, there's two more things. One is that we are bereft of connection to soul, spirit, in that way that is, as you've just said, our birthright. And our children come to this world. They choose us, definitely. And they come with a specific gift to each of us. And when, as we said earlier, when we have our own wounds and they're hidden, plastered over, maybe, for good reason, our children trigger those wounds. And that makes it unbelievably difficult to parent, to be the mother. I know that from my personal experience. I mean, it's not something that we sort of have talked about, because we talked about me in a different context, but I know that from my own personal experience. And me as a mother, healing my own wounds, and continuing to be, by the way, there's no perfection here, has allowed me in my day-to-day life to be such, I'm not even going to I was going to say better mama, and that's not true. It just allowed me to be a happier, more easeful, more mother that I really want to be. Does that make sense, Leanne?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Before we are almost out of time. Yes. I'm enjoying this conversation so much. There's such it's medicine in itself. I can really feel that. What I would love to know is, in fact, I can give an example myself as a kind of starter for 10, but some of the practices that you yourself kind of in your work go very deep with, but can actually see these have a place in, any woman's life, any mother's life that's called to them, which could be, for example, that connection to the elements, like working very consciously with things, again, that those of us called to a shamanic path kind of, is part of the work to go very, very deep. And yet they do have a place in anyone's life that wants a connection to something deeper. What might that look like for the women working with you?
That's a beautiful question. And I think we've done it more when Kate and I did a couple of our cherished mother containers. I led people through journeys around the elements, as you sort of suggested, and people really naturally, it was really, sort of first times, because obviously I've done it and done it deeply. People really felt that connection.
Almost like we've been doing this for hundreds of thousands of years, isn't it?
Exactly. I know. Exactly. Or, which I found just beautifully fascinating, is when they weren't connected. They could get a sense in their bodies, like once we drop out of our heads and things, they really could sort of feel, oh, there's no candle there inside me. When you ask me to imagine the flame, it's gone, Janet.
Yes, there's the absence sometimes that can be
Yeah.
telling of what's needed to be reclaimed.
Yeah, or as like with the water, wow, there's too much. I can't feel it. It's pushing me back, and they could naturally see. And that's why I think, like you said about the elements, this is like my favorite topic of conversation. It's there around us, and we all know that nature is good for us, but this is deeper. But it can show us by looking out and feeling and having these experiences of the elements. We can use it internally because it's in us too. So it's just a really beautiful way of helping people understand their internal world, understand their own internal system, and beginning to gently and lovingly opening them to see where their wounds are, and lovingly and slowly inviting them into a connection with spirit.
Beautiful. And so women that are hearing what you're talking about and feeling a draw to that exploration, where can they find out more about you and your work?
They can find out about me at therootedmother.co.uk, which is my own website. And it's close to happening. I'm creating a very short, very gentle introduction to the elements, which we just spoke about, which we hadn't planned, by the way, at all. So they'll be able to find out about that. They'll also be able to have tarot, which is cards, which is another thing that we haven't brought up in this conversation.
Yes, that's been a whole journey as well.
Yeah, that's another. So there's that, and one-to-one work, and then the other person that's briefly been mentioned in this space but needs an even bigger mention, and part of my journey with you has also been meeting Kate.
The beautiful Kate.
I mean, that's been of itself, that has been top gift. Actually, there are about 5 top gifts. The gorgeous Kate embodying her high priestess role, and let's just say an archetype was birthed. She came knocking on her door, and we have honoured her. And whilst it might make no logical sense to have 2 websites, and Kate has her own, we've trusted her. So we have thecherishedmother.com, and really in that space we're creating more group programs as well. And the work there is a lot more around women generally rather than specifically for mothers.
Beautiful. I got such a thrill listening to that, particularly when you said the work you're doing with Kate. It's like, oh my goodness, it's talk about the unfolding of your myths and then the intertwining of them both in this just such perfect way. Like you couldn't make up the perfection of this. It's so beautiful. Oh, Janet, this has been a delight. I cannot wait for the women this is meant for, that you are medicine for, to receive it. But thank you so much. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you, Leanne.
I very much hope you enjoyed watching that. And if you did and you're not already subscribed, then do hit that bell thingy and subscribe to automatically get each fresh new episode as it's released each week. If you'd like to find out more about the work we do at Be Mythical to guide and support old souls in this new world to live their own unique myth, Do hop along to bemythical.com and you'll find out all the ways you can join us and go deeper with us on your own mythical journey. Lots of love for now. Mwah. See you again next week.